Welcome back to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, activists, and others on topics of higher education, free speech, and other related topics on American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as on any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, or Anchor. Download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you heard today, give our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. Well, I'm very excited to welcome Yeonmi Park to the show today. Thank you so much, Yeonmi, for joining. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were born in the darkness, which is North Korea, and you experienced quite the difficult childhood. But when you moved to America, we'll talk a little about we'll touch a little on your path coming here, because I do want to focus on some of the main themes of your current book. But when you did get here, you started to notice something eerily similar to that darkness when you were on college campus, Columbia University in New York City. So your most recent book, I'll hold it up here so everyone who's watching video can see, which is called While Time Remains. It gives a foreboding outlook into America's future if we continue down the paths of censorship and coercion that you have witnessed, based on your experiences. So let's start off with just kind of what moment did you realize you needed to write about this? Like, what were you seeing? What was going on in your life when you were in the United States that you're like, wait, I need to write another book? Because I know your first book is all about your journey out of North Korea and your experiences there. But what made you want to write a second book kind of talking about your experiences here in America?
So when I got to America, of course, I imagined this to be the land of the free, home of the brave, the shining liberty bell rings where individuals are treated as equal, and the state determined to protect individual liberty above anything else. Unlike North Korea, where individuals do not matter unless you're part of the collective. So with that promise and expectation, I came to America and going to Columbia University. The reason I decided to write this book is because I was able to clearly see that writing on the wall, that path that these big universities are choosing to go down. It's in a way, it's like really more concerning because they are doing this in the name of inclusion and in the name of compassion. They are redefining the word, what it means to be inclusive. And that's a scary time to be alive because these words don't mean the same thing anymore. And what scared me to being from North Korea is that the regime deprived us of understanding this concept of human rights, liberty, freedom, love. And now I'm coming to America where I was witnessing this revolution that was happening, how this even basic idea of inclusiveness was being redefined. And that was becoming like North Korea, the manipulation, the cancel culture, the mob, shutting down people for thinking differently. And I think that's really basically it, because I was seeing the same tactics that was happening in North Korea here happening in America.
So what were some of those? So when let's start when you're at Columbia University, what are some examples, I guess, of your education in the classroom or various experiences with campus culture at Columbia that kind of reminded you of moments in your life under Kim Jong-il's totalitarian regime?
So above all, everything else, like the most thing that stood out to me was the anti-American, anti-Western sentiment in college. That in North Korea, literally, the regime blames for every aspect of failure in the system. So instance, like if the electricity goes up, the regime said, because of American bastards. Because if you have flooding, because of American bastards. At Columbia, if there's a flooding happening, because of greedy capitalism and climate change causing it. If there's any injustice and poverty and war happening, it's because of a white man and then greedy capitalism. So that, in a way, it's like, North Korea copied Columbia, Columbia copied North Korea. The conclusion to whatever explanation you can come up to is the same conclusion. And where it goes down to where only solution is that tearing down the Constitution, tearing down the American system of government, and we need to rebuild the nation in the name of equity, which means collectivism.
Right.
And I think that's when I really understood this is not something just you are entertaining some subset ideas. they have a clear goal to educating these brightest people in the world in a way, right? That people going to Colombia are one of the smartest people in America. Mm-hmm. And they brainwash them to believe that the only goal is going to be dismantling American system.
That's fascinating that this concept that you just brought up, that this term equity, which is being thrown a lot around a lot right now by the left, it's supposed to be kind of a spin-off of equality, and that how they define it is that they want equal results as well as they want equal outcomes as well as equal opportunity. But you're calling it, you're even tying it to the collectivism concept, which is a communist concept. And so that's really, really fascinating to me, because I don't think enough of the folks out there are making these types of connections and really trying to tie this. These are not original ideas. They have existed for generations. And, we've seen them in action in North Korea and as well as in China, but in history as well, we've seen these types of totalitarian regimes exist all over the world. And they use they might use different words, but they use the same concepts. It's always the same concepts, because everything those concepts are what ultimately lead to power and control and manipulation. So this idea of blaming outsiders for all of your problems. So in North Korea, to me, that actually makes a little bit more sense, that they would blame, because no one in North Korea has access to outside information. So the government has complete control of everything that's coming in, so they can blame anyone they want for all the problems, and it keeps them as the good guys. But at Columbia, it's interesting because there's so much evidence that actually there are, more nuanced issues and more nuanced solutions to a lot of the problems they're seeing, and doesn't directly have to do with capitalism or the American Constitution being racist. So I'm kind of curious, did you ever ask any of these students, or did you ever ask them to kind of explain their logic and their reasoning and how they come to these conclusions? And what happened when you did push back on these ideas when you were on campus?
Yeah, so I think that's what remarkable to me, that they have one of the biggest libraries in the world. They have so many books and information where they can see the opposite inside. However, when I asked my professor in my senior year, I remember my professor was telling us that there is no difference between men and women, that everybody can be a woman or man. And I asked my professor, I just became a mother that year. So I was clearly to me what my body could do that men cannot do, right? But I just reproduce a child that way. So I don't think I can be a man. And she said, you are brainwashed. So they will not try to engage you and trying to bring the facts, or in a way respectfully disagree with you. But they say, if anybody disagrees with this political correctness, you are evil. And that idea is dangerous. Therefore, we cannot discuss that, and because we have inclusive, safe space,
right?
But it's not inclusive and it's not safe. We're having a different idea, complete opposite meaning they are using, but they're using this wrong word, and we're defining this word, saying because Colombia is safe space, that we cannot have this bigotry, dangerous ideas, and those dangerous ideas are not even worth to discuss because they are evil. They're immoral.
Yeah.
And that's how they shut down the opposing side. So there's no way you can really argue or asking questions, because in a way you're scared. They say, if you see something, say something, that where you can even report to your classmates, saying they are, transphobic, they are, all these phobics that you can talk about. And if that goes to the council of a university, you can even get kicked out eventually. So the risk is so high to stand up, and eventually you have to join this groupthink. Otherwise, it's the consequence too high for you to stand up.
And this is the how they continue to gain control is by making sure they constantly increase that barrier, that threshold for what the consequences are. For if you do stand up. So right now it's getting reported and possibly in trouble on campus. But there's, it's going to escalate. And we've seen it escalate on campuses where students have been expelled for being accused of harassment or, kicked off campus during certain investigations. They're being accused of harassment for things like just not using someone's preferred pronoun. So there's, you talked a little bit about these reporting systems that exist, right? And I mean, like, talk about something out of, whether it be North Korea or George Orwell or something. This is just fascinating to me that it has increased. We did a study on these bias reporting systems is what they tend to go by. We did a study on this last year and found that there's been a 200% increase over the last 5 years of these on college campuses. We looked at over 800 universities and 56% of them have a form of these bias reporting systems. And what it is for listeners, I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about this before, but they're anonymous reporting systems where students can, like you said, there's signs all over the campus that says, see something, say something. And they're not talking about backpacks and terrorism. They're talking about if you see someone make a joke that you don't like, or if someone says something like a stereotype or a microaggression, that's what they want you to report. And they keep files on students who are reported. And they investigate them. This is all constitutionally protected speech. And in a country that has a First Amendment that's specifically in place to protect those rights, most would be surprised. And I'm sure you were surprised when you came onto campus to see that, wow, they're practicing kind of some similar policies here that actually we had in North Korea. So what are your thoughts on these reporting systems? And have you been reported? Do you know folks who've been reported? And have you had any experience with them?
So about this reporting system, right? It's in a way that North Korea, we something have called a self-criticism session every week for children. And if you're artist and authority, you have to do every 2 days. You need to criticize yourself about you not being the best revolution you can be in the social system, and you have to criticize somebody. You must. It's not a optional thing. You have to choose somebody to criticize. So entire week, you're going to look for somebody's fault. And what was beautiful about this free system where people have a right to express their opinions and not get persecuted for it is where you have trust. That what's amazing about in North Korea, the first thing my mom told me as a young girl was don't even whisper because the birds and mice could hear me. And now living in America is not that degree of paranoia, but on campus, right? Like what you tweet, it might catch up with you 20 years later with you. And you can lose your job and your dignity, your family, your friends for that. And this makes us less trusting of each other. And when that happens, when people are divided and hating each other, cannot cooperate with the other person, that is a perfect time for the authoritarian to rise and control people and divide people. So this tactic of division and hate with each other used in all the dictatorship countries. They don't like when people trust each other, when they are talking to each other, relying on each other. They love when people hate each other and not trusting each other. And this culture of a cancel culture and persecuting people for their ideas ultimately creates distrust between people. And that is so bad for the democracy to work. So at Columbia, I did not know anybody openly disagree with the doctrine of Columbia at all. And actually, when I got graduated and when I was on New York Post and Fox, that I got reached out on LinkedIn from so many alums to saying that's how they exactly felt. And even some of the classmates who were at the orientation with me in the same exact orientation said they felt exactly the same way or even same class, but they could not express to me at the time.
Right.
So we did not know that they existed. Just now I know, okay, they existed, but they were saying, don't say this too publicly because I'm too afraid to lose my job because they are in the corporate world.
Right. So you mentioned these orientations and kind of what they teach you guys there. This divisiveness concept. So we've also looked a lot into what these orientation materials are and kind of done a lot of work on why are students using the reporting systems, right? Why is that their first reaction is to report on each other? And it's because the universities in a lot of ways are laying the groundwork for that mentality by, like you said, creating this divisiveness. They are having students focus on the qualities that divide them, like race and religion and sex and gender, and not focusing on the things that unite them, which is that, hey, you're all in this together. You're students. This is going to be a hard 4 years. We hope you can work together and get along. Instead, they want people to think about microaggressions and trigger warnings and constantly be aware of the fact that they could offend each other or upset one another. So I'm curious what your orientation was like when you first walked on campus. What was your first impression? What were some of the topics that they wanted to focus on and cover when you were there?
Yeah, so this idea of being woke was not a bad term, even when I was at Columbia in 2016. It's something they would encourage us to be woke. And now I think they are even afraid to using that term, and they hate it when we call them woke. But at 2016, I joined in January. I transferred from South Korean University. The biggest two contrasts you can ever imagine, right? South Korean universities are all about competition and competence and hard work and resilience. And coming to America suddenly now is all about how to identify yourself as a victim, how to resent, how to complain, and how to be offended. All about they are teaching you the ways to be offended in a way. I did not know in that many ways in the world you could be offended. Where they saying you cannot use the word master bedroom. Wow. Because of the slavery, and now it's offended the people. I did not know there were that many ways to be offended. And
masters also. The weird thing is the masters existed before slavery existed.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway,
and for them, the history doesn't work that way. And it's the only oppression in the past happened was by white men to other people of color. And did you hear about Persian Empire? Did you hear about Ottomans? Did you hear about other empires before this? In other colonialism happened, but of course that doesn't count to these people. But at this orientation, where instructor gave us an example of how to be woke, and I initially didn't get it because I just learned English and I'm awake. How can I be woke more than this, right? And they're no, example of being woke is like this. Who likes to read Jane Austen? And I love literature. So I thought I love to read Jane Austen. And she said, if this is the way you're perpetuating the bigotry, because Jane Austen lived in an era of colonialism and white supremacy, that she believed that somehow the only white men were capable of logical thinking. And anybody else other than white men were not capable of doing that. So by reading her work, I get brainwashed and I'm perpetuating all that hate to other people. So that's how I need to be woke and noticing those bigotries and systemic racism and not reading and subscribing to those ideologies.
Wow.
And at this point,
yeah. I mean, that's the first thing you're talking about on campus. What was your reaction? Did you just kind of say, okay, this person's crazy, I'm going to go over here now? Or was it more oh, is this just the American way of thinking about the world? Is this what it means to be rich and well off? You can just kind of have these weird strains of thought. You have this luxury to think about these things a little too much sometimes.
So really, to be honest, I don't think I had necessarily thought that was initially for the first 2 years. I was more amazed and curious to learn why they think that way. And I also did not think that this was how the mainstream view was. I thought it was just maybe a peculiar thing that was happening in Columbia. Gotcha. I did not read the things that was happening at Harvard at the time. And by the third year, that's when I really was understood, okay, this is what's happening, right? A cultural revolution of America. But the first 2 years, I gave them the benefit of that. I really tried my best to understand that maybe there is some merit in their thinking. Maybe what am I missing that I never thought this way? So I gave them the 2 years of benefit of doubt. And I keep challenging myself, let me see from your perspective. And that's when I really noticed, okay, they are brainwashed. There's no other conclusion other than that. And it seems that it's not just began at Columbia. All these kids coming from Andover, all these private schools, elite institutions before coming to Columbia, their parents are well-off people, most of them, right? They can afford that tuition. And they were brainwashed long before campus. And in a way that I realized that the professors were appeasing their base. Some of them seemed like passionately leading them to these certain like ideas, but also some of them are just like lip servicing too, because they were expecting us to think that way. In a way, it was not like led by professors all the time.
Right.
It was also led by students themselves.
Yeah, I guess the professors probably also were a little concerned about getting in trouble themselves, because we've seen a number of incidents where professors have lost tenure and been fired just by offending the wrong person on campus. That's interesting. So how many students would you say are probably completely brainwashed and bought into all of this versus the number of students that are probably just like staying quiet and not engaging and just like nodding their heads?
So I took first 2 years, I studied economics. And at the econ, even I remember they were saying why the women's soccer team doesn't get paid as much as the men's group. And to me, it made sense. Like if I go sing on the stage and if I don't get paid $1 million for that, it's fine because I'm a bad singer. Like Beyonce can get paid that money. It makes sense. Just there's so many expensive tickets. Right. Like to me, it was a complete common sense why the revenue is different. How many people are more interested in like men's soccer? Right. It was not about systemic any bigotry towards women. It just the revenue was a very different thing. Right. And for them, they just really couldn't comprehend why the equality of outcome is not possible if our American system is just. So I think, but though I do think it wasn't as bad as taking core classes where we are learning humanity or literature and writing and history, biology, all of that. It was not as bad. But even in econ, I definitely felt, why is it not understandable to these people that there is inequality? Because they are so good at math. I mean, for me, I was struggling with math. I mean, they were like taking calculus 4 and then post math, like complete different level of math they're taking and cannot grasp this concept that inequality of outcome is something natural thing to happen.
It's almost like you would expect, kind of like being in their mind. They're very logical thinkers and other things, and that they can do math and they're studying economics, but there's like a cognitive dissonance. Like they are not connecting the realities to like the kind of like what they're saying and what the ideas that they're espousing. So for someone who's very reasonable and logical thinking, it would be actually really exhausting to constantly have that internal battle and you have to really kind of be bought in order to just kind of have blinders on, you're basically not using everything that you've learned to apply to what you're seeing in reality. Instead, you're just kind of taking your ideas, and then reality exists over here, and you keep them separate and compartmentalized from each other. That's really interesting. So I want to go back to some of your time in South Korea. So when you were at the university there, I'm curious what you kind of touched a little bit on your experiences at the universities there versus the university time here. I'm curious what some of the major differences in, like you talked about the competitiveness and the difference there. But I mean, look, you came from, I think you said that you had like coming out of North Korea, maybe like a 3rd grade education, and you said that you're an avid reader and you loved, I mean, I looked at the list of books that you've said you've read, like Orwell, Jane Austen, like these are not, easy things for someone, especially who's been kind of removed from society for so long, someone to like come in and just like read these, I imagine would be like very eye-opening, and it would like, I can't even imagine what that would feel like, just kind of hearing all of these voices and reading all of these words. So I'm curious what your initial education was like and what really pushed you to pick up those texts specifically, and kind of kept you hungry to learn more.
So it's a definitely in life, I do think that's why the, equity is not possible. I just had my genetic tendency, love learning and reading. Like I was living in this dorm with other girls, and they were amused that I was up until 5 a.m. in the morning reading. I would not make friends because my best friend was books. I was reading, and they were just like, nobody forcing me to read. It was like my natural tendency. And I think comes from my both parents who were loved reading. Even in North Korea, they always thought the education was the most important thing. Even in North Korea, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
at that point, it could be my like that value that drew into me when I was kids, but also I had like my natural tendency I had in me. And then whenever you start reading this like Western classical music, I mean, classical books, Penguin, like in the back, they give 50 to list other books, right? And
Yeah.
then you read the one like classical of the Shakespeare's of tragedy. Then there's a 4 other ones you gotta read, and then the other side. So you keep going, following those tracks, and whenever you read more, you realize how much you don't know, and it makes you read more, right? So, but the thing is also South Korea. When I got there, they told me, South Korea, we have justice system. And I asked them, like, what is justice? And they say, in South Korea, if you work hard, you are going to get rewarded for it. And that's how I understood justice, nothing else. It was not about complaining or seeking or asking for the handouts. For me, justice was, if I work hard, I'm going to get rewarded for it. And that was amazing to me from North Korea, because like in a way in America now, you cannot change your skin color. Like they say, my son, like they call me that I'm a privileged person because of my skin color, that I'm not black. And I cannot possibly understand oppression because I'm a white passing person. That's what Colombia said. Like, what can I do with my skin color? There's nothing I can do to change. And in South Korea, it's all about, they are emphasizing what you can change. You can change your situation, environment by learning the right skills, getting a right job, and being responsible, making better decisions. And South Korea is always emphasizing on what you can change.
Right.
And in America, it's not becoming like North Korea, where what you cannot change.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, that is really fascinating, because you're right. To maintain control, again, this does come down to controlling the masses and trying to control the way people think. If you have these immutable characteristics that you cannot change about yourself, then all of a sudden, especially like when we're talking about race, and if that puts you at a disadvantage, and you stack classes based on race, which is so funny, because in America we have had these conversations before. We've had these debates. This has been an issue that's settled for a long time in this country. So it is fascinating that we are basically having the exact same debates over again, just using slightly different language. And yeah, I imagine you're seeing the same parallels of what happened in North Korea, with these kind of characteristics that force you like a peg in a hole, like this is where you are, and this is where you're going to remain, and there's literally no way to escape it. So talk about a little bit about your time, of like some of the stuff you had going on in North Korea when you were a child growing up there. Compare like some of the stuff that was happening there that you think is eerily similar to what you're seeing in America right now.
Yeah, so talking about this caste system, in a way, North Korea founded the idea of equality of outcomes, right? Kim Il-sung came, is like, look at those landlords or landowners and the capitalists. They have all the assets and money and power, and you poor peasant, you don't have anything. You have to work for them, and that you don't keep a lot. So let's make everything equal. But with that promise, he divided North Korea into 51 different caste systems.
Wow.
And what's shocking about North Korea is that we are same genetics, same people, same language, same skin color. We are like same in a homogeneous country.
Yeah.
You can come up with the 51 different classes. But this has to be all based on what your ancestors did. So if your ancestor was a educated university professor, now you're oppressor class, right? And now they put in oppressed class. And then like if your grandfather, like me, great-great-grandfather, I don't know how many generations goes up, and maybe 4 generations goes up, on the tiny land in from his home. So he marked as a landowner. Therefore, now when I was born in the country, I was a oppressor. My genetics was oppressive to other people. Then my blood was literally tainted. That's what they say. Your blood is tainted because of what my ancestors chose to do with their lives. And these things you cannot change, and your fate is determined before you were born.
Right.
And now in America, same thing. Like if you're white, you're privileged, you're guilty, and their fate determined way before they're even being conceived. So exactly the same tactic they're using, dividing people for their ancestors' crime.
Yeah.
And nobody in America right now who's alive owned a slave or owned a slave.
Mm-hmm.
Now they have to answer to their ancestors' crimes. Like, how is that ever possible?
Right.
Like, there's no way we can make that pass right in any sense. And so it's like forever division, forever war. And when there is war and people hating each other, it's a perfect time for them to control everything.
That is fascinating. As you were describing that caste system and how it was set up based on ancestry, I mean, it's just, I honestly didn't know about that. And that is, to me, it's exactly the type of language and the type of thinking that we're seeing when it comes to the reparations conversations for slavery and like the constant racial division, or like the pushing for racial division. That is fascinating that is actually a tactic that also is not original. This has been used before. None of these ideas are original. Nothing's new. So I want to chat about something that you mentioned in your book. You talk a little bit about the hypocrisy of the global elite, kind of illustrated by some of your experiences from, like, I think it was Woman in the World, Campfire, TED, Met Galas, kind of. So, can you shed some light on what your experiences here were for our listeners?
So I was in the beginning the arms of the liberals because my agent was making sure that I never talk to anybody coming from conservative side, never go on the Fox News, never talking to New York Post. And at the time I didn't even know what that was. Like, that's the thing. When I came to America, I did not know what conservative or liberal was. I had no agenda whatsoever. I just came here to go where educating people, raising awareness about
your agenda
North
was
Korea.
Freedom and education.
That was it. That's all I understood. I did not even know anything. And then I noticed these people, they are putting the black squares on their screen and talk about Black Lives Matter and denouncing slavery. And I knew that they talk about how much they care about this injustice that's happening, especially when it comes to slavery and inequality for women and women suffering. So I thought all my job was going to meet those people and telling them what's happening. I thought they would join me to helping these oppressed people. That's how naively I thought. That's all they require because all their image is like in the public, how much they care about these injustices.
Right.
So I flew in a private jet on the Gulf Stream from New York to Jeff Bezos' event in California, in Santa Barbara with Harvey Weinstein.
Wow.
The timing was peculiar because that was a really not that long before the Me Too.
Oh.
And once I go there, everybody was giving the Harvey a stand-up ovation and telling him that you are the man, you are the light to all these people, and how Harvey does so much good in the world.
Wow.
And of course, the entire thing was dedicated to hating Trump and conservatives. And then I got to talk to them about what's happening in North Korea. And I was telling them how North Korean women are being sold in China as sex slaves. And you would think all these people are having no problem standing up for girls who were captured by ISIS or Boko Haram or Taliban. I thought they would not do the same thing if I told about these girls in China from North Korea or their organs are harvested out of them. And they said, I'm sorry what happened, but please don't tell people that I know you. And really? I was very perplexed of what's happening. Yeah. And I realized they have strong, deep ties with economic relationship with China. China is the biggest middle class market in the world, and nobody want to lose that market.
Wow. Yeah.
Unfortunately. So nobody that I met, that those social justice warriors, that the American elites, when you actually talk to them, they do not care about these issues. They just want to do whatever is profitable. Talking about slavery, that makes people happy. Now they're going to talk about it, but they don't care about any of this stuff in real world. And I think that's when I understood, like in North Korea, the elites talk about how they care about the people. All day long, they're up at night thinking about the well-being of people. And real life, they're all selfish, corrupt people who are feasting on our suffering and taking advantage of our suffering. And that's how they gain all that power. And that's when I understood how corrupt American elites are.
That's really interesting because you would think they would be more caring and sympathetic to the North Korean stuff. But the second you introduce China into the equation, all of a sudden they see all of their money at risk, because we all know Hollywood at this point is very obsessed with the Chinese movie market. They know it's, an easy billion or so viewers for whatever movies China allows in. So they have to keep China happy in order to get their movies seen by the Chinese people. And that brings me to the next point that I did want to bring up to you, because this is something you also touch on, which is this, the CCP's goal of global hegemony. And, what they're doing to dominate not only the region that they're operating in, but like what they're doing to infiltrate U.S. culture and, try to create a further divide within American culture. So I want to get your thoughts on like what China's doing here in America and what you see as most threatening, but also let's talk a little bit about kind of like what they're doing, what their interactions are with North Korea, because I think a lot of people are curious about what that actual connection is with North Korea.
So to talk about North Koreans, actually, like China funds Kim Jong-un.
Okay.
And not only that, there's a new types of colonialism that began with China. They go to countries like North Korea that are so poor. They say, we're going to give you support. We're going to give you oil, because North Korea needs oil to test nukes. They don't have natural resource to get an oil. And nobody in the world can give that to North Korea because of international sanctions. We all know North Korea gets that oil, they're going to test missiles, creating the nuclear weapons to destroy humanity. So that would be so evil giving Kim Jong-un that tool. China does. Even during the pandemic, I think New York Times, I was surprised they covered this, how they using gigantic ship and covering all the sanctions and giving it to Kim Jong-un to test more nukes. And with that, they come to North Korea and say, we are going to leasing this mine, the core mine or different mines for 100 years, some of them 200 years, some of them 300 years. In that time, if the regime fails to pay them back, what happens? China takes it. That's how the new colonialism began under China, of this economic support. And they know for sure that North Korea cannot pay that back. Then eventually they can take over North Korea. And North Korea is a puppet state. It's run by China, and they do not have any independence from China. So in a way, that accountability is not lying on Kim Jong-un, it's lying on CCP. But the Western politicians, they don't ask China for these crimes. They keep blaming Kim Jong-un, because in a way, Kim Jong-un is like powerless. What he can do? He's a puppet. Like nothing he can do independently outside of Chinese rule.
That's interesting, because before we get into the stuff that China's doing in the US, I mean, so when like Trump, for example, visits Kim Jong-un, like what exactly is he accomplishing there? Because if China is running the show, then what's the point of doing a public meeting? I mean, I guess maybe is it just for show, or was there actually something that he was trying to accomplish?
So do you remember when Trump was trying to meet him, and what was the first thing Kim Jong-un did? Visiting Xi Jinping in Beijing. Right.
He had to get a sign off.
Of course, yeah. The first thing, so it was like nobody in the West was questioning that why Kim Jong-un seeing Xi Jinping right before seeing Trump every single time. Kim Jong-un keep going to see, like you can even look it up. He was taking train from Pyongyang to Beijing directly and seeing Xi Jinping first. Xi Jinping would not allow Kim Jong-un to meet Trump without telling him what exactly to do during those meetings. So I think that's why I was a huge opponent of Trump meeting Kim Jong-un, giving him the legitimacy, all that spotlight on this dictator, because in a way, Kim Jong-un had no power to change anything. It had to align with Chinese CCP's policy. And it was a huge photo stunt, and it was a huge photo op. You can get a lot of attention for that, but what did anybody achieve at the moment? Nothing. The suffering continued, and human rights didn't get resolved. So I do think that that's where the Western leaders are not paying attention to, that the real solution is going to come from China. If we do not convince China to do something about human rights abuses happening, there's never going to be a solution there coming out of North Korea.
Right. Wow. That's really, I mean, that's something that it's funny, because I can't imagine you're the only person in the world who knows this about, North Korea being kind of like this more puppet state. I mean, this is something, my background's a little bit in national security, and it was kind of talked about a lot in that way. But you would think at least, I guess most people probably don't realize that, if the president's visiting North Korea, I mean, he needs to talk directly to China. And the fact that what's going on in North Korea can only really be fixed through China really puts us in a difficult position, because essentially, if we did want to do anything about it, which is we can talk a little bit about kind of your efforts in trying to get more attention on this. It would be a very uphill battle. I mean, China's a formidable foe. I mean, they are a difficult one for us to go after. And let's talk first, though, a little bit about some of the stuff you're seeing here that China's doing in the U.S., and what your thoughts are on how they've infiltrated our institutions and our culture, because I think this speaks to just how insidious they are, just how much they've reached into what we have, and how big of a foe they actually are.
So it's not my big area of expertise in my
Right.
relationship completely with North Korea and China only. But I mean, as you can see, I saw even in college campuses how much the professors were sympathetic to Chinese regime because their research funding can come from them, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing good come out of criticizing China in a lot of times. And these big Ivy League schools have a huge international students body that come from China, gets money from the regime, and they get a lot of funding from those countries. And like you said about Hollywood, right? All these studios, when there were time, one of the producers in Hollywood were trying to make a movie about my first book, and she sent me a script and says that when I got to China, I wasn't trafficked. China was my promised land and protect me and giving me a refugee. And I was asking him, like, what are you talking about? I was like sold into sex slavery. And he said, this is the only way we can make a movie about North Korean current Hollywood. Because if the studio that funds my movie, they have so many other movies that are funded by China that will all drop. So no studio would ever take that risk. Right. So representation of China gets completely biased in Hollywood. And the media too. I mean, China has so much influence. And not only that, even TikTok. Like, I'm a mother myself. These garbage app are putting so much garbage into the heads of American young minds. And it's such a destructive app. And somehow China has a right to ban Google and Facebook and economists, all other platforms. But somehow America has to not do it because supposedly the First Amendment's again. Right? But it's only when the national security, we really cannot do that. And it seems like such an unbalanced match that we are playing. And people don't know that China is the biggest cheat in the world. They cheat in everything that we do with them. And they are not a fair partner. And they don't realize that Chinese goal is trying to make America be like China eventually. Because any democracy is a threat to dictatorship. Because now people are going to see that, like, oh, this is not supposedly how humans be treated. That's why every dictatorship that hates democracy, because that's a threat, and then people want to escape there. But if the entire world becomes like China and North Korea, they don't have to worry about ever again because people don't even know what the alternative looks like.
Right. There's no alternative. And that's kind of what's so important about American culture and just kind of maintaining like this, not only our constitutional protections to our rights of free speech and expression and religious liberty and everything that we talk about a lot here and we espouse principally. And it has a lot to do with the fact that, look, we are the best alternative to all of these like horrible regimes that exist. And even the ones that are like, kind of liberal, but also kind of terrible, like most of Europe and Canada, where they don't really protect the rights as well as we do in the United States. America is kind of the last best hope, essentially. And if we're diminished, if we lose the thing that makes us so unique and special, which is this appreciation of freedom and a small R Republican government, then what is there for people in North Korea to escape to, or in China to escape to? That is something that I think a lot of folks really need to think about. So there's some stuff that I've heard. So I've heard you talk about this before in some of your other podcasts, guest shows that you've done, talking about this idea, and I think it comes up in your book too, how the Korean regime uses kind of control of thought. And I think I first heard you on Joe Rogan, I think it was a little while ago. And it was, he asked you when you were talking about the horrors of what you saw in North Korea and just like the starvation, the dead bodies everywhere, just the terrible suffering that everyone is going through. He asked you why people didn't rise up, why they didn't revolt. And I think your answer was because they didn't know that they should. I think it was something along the lines of they didn't know that they should, that it wasn't really registering, that it wasn't people, it was just the norm. Like what they were seeing was not considered something that you would rise up against. I want you to talk about kind of that mentality, that level of kind of apathy that exists because of just accepting everything that you're hearing constantly, and how certain regimes take advantage of that mentality, right? Being ignorant to certain things, or like not advocating for, our free speech rights, not trying to push back or challenge ideas. You kind of wonder with these students on campus that don't push back, what's going on in their minds? Do they even notice what's going on, or is this considered normal for them? But just kind of talk about, I know I just laid a lot out there, but if you can just talk about some of the themes that I just touched on, I think that'd be really interesting for our listeners to hear.
Yeah, I think that's when I was like looking at my classmates and they're telling me how they're oppressed. And I was like thinking, if you're oppressed, you not know.
Right,
Not knowing is the definition of oppression. Like in North Korea, the reason we do not have a revolution is because we don't know that we are slaves.
Right.
And if you don't know you're a slave, how do you fight to be free? You don't even know.
Right.
And I think that is the degree of oppression that we don't, I think Americans cannot comprehend. And the control of thoughts come from control of language, right? In North Korea, if you say one wrong thing, it's not going to kill you just only, it's going to kill up to 3 to 8 generations of your family. They said, get rid of the entire seed of possibility of rebellion. Like if somebody took your father away, the children might like prepare revenge. And that's why they take the generations out of that. So they eliminate the possibility of a rebellion. And they're completely controlling our thoughts. Like we don't know what love is. We don't know what freedom is. And if you don't know the words, that means you don't understand the concept. And that's why this war on language in America right now is so scary. They are doing this in the name of good intentions, right? In the name of inclusivity and safe space. But once we started battling on what words can be and what it cannot be, what can be said, what can it not be said, it's a very slippery slope like North Korea, right, where eventually we don't have that even function to think because those concepts are taken away from us.
Right.
And I think that's why the freedom of speaking, the language is so important.
Right. No, that's really true. I think George Orwell laid the best example out in 1984 of how this really works when you have this concept of 2 + 2 = 5, and the state is telling you that 2 + 2 = 5, you logically in your mind know that it's not true. But if they can get you to say it over time, over and over and over again, then eventually you will start to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. And when we're talking about the control of language, the forced control of language, and we're talking about, for example, like the transgender movement that is dictating essentially what would be like totalitarian tactics, which is that you have to change your words. You have to use the words that we specify when we specify you use them. And you can't, there's no other option. That mentality is something that kind of really touches on that, especially if you don't believe what you're saying. But if you keep saying it more and more and more, eventually they can get you to believe it. So I know we're about to wrap up here, but I just want to get a sense from you on some of the work that you've been doing to help those in North Korea, and kind of use this as a platform to reach out to our listeners and tell them kind of, what they can do to continue to defend free speech rights in America, but then also to fight to help those who are still stuck under the terrible regime in North Korea and under China.
Yeah, so I work with the Human Rights Foundation, and we send like USB thumb drives or SD cards. Have you ever heard about these balloon launches that defectors do in South Korea? We send in these big balloons, and we put the leaflets and USB drives that containing the thought of freedom and democracy in it, and really trying to free the North Korean minds, because freeing physical body is a lot easier than freeing your mind. And this is like dictators really understand. North Korea, there's 2 types of dictatorship. Physical dictatorship, where you have no freedom of movement. You are not allowed to dress certain things. You are not allowed to read certain things or listen or watch any movie. But second dictatorship is where something called dictatorship of the mind.
Mm.
And this is when they started controlling thoughts and you're not free to think.
Yeah.
And this is happening in America right now. We have the freedom of movement. We can, watch whatever Netflix show that we want. However, that dictatorship mind begins, and this is also happened in Nazi Germany. In any kind of totalitarian state, they control your thoughts.
Right.
So we try our best to free North Korean minds and for them to understand what was happening. And there are lots of NGOs that are South Korea that rescue North Korean defectors. So if you just look up on Google, rescue organization for North Korean defectors, you will see and you can find the best and you want to support.
That's so great. Wow. What an effort. I mean, it's great. I mean, I can't even imagine how many people probably are, have been freed or helped because of the work that you've been doing. And it's admirable that, after escaping, I mean, you could have done anything, right? You could have gone off and just lived your life, a simple, happy life, but you're taking on the mantle, you're writing books about free speech, you're battling the culture wars here in America, but you're also battling an entire regime of North Korea and trying to help people escape. So it's quite the admirable life that you've chosen. Your kids are going to have someone really great to look up to. And it's such a fantastic story. For those listening, it is While Time Remains. It's a great, great book talking about some of the, like I said, the eerie parallels between what Yeonmi Park saw in North Korea and what she's experiencing here in America. And, she has another book too, that came out, I think, was it a couple years ago already now? Or?
Oh, it's been a while, 2015, I think.
Oh, wow. It was that long ago? Okay,
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And that just lays out her experience. So I'll put a link in this show as well to her previous book to kind of talk. So if you were curious about her actual experience living under the North Korean regime and her escape story, that is outlined there. And remind me what that one is called.
In Order to Live.
In Order to Live, right? Appropriately titled. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Any final words or goodbyes to the listeners?
No, thank you for listening and watching, and hopefully keep supporting this free speech.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm Cherise Trump, and Yeonmi. That was well said.